Hello, welcome to Class Time, your daily classroom for CSEC students. You can watch this lesson in real time on Television Jamaica's YouTube channel or One Spot Media. Send your questions to Television Jamaica's Facebook page at Television Jamaica or Instagram at television_Jamaica, or use the hashtag TVJClassTime. We will be continuing where we left off yesterday with narrative writing and plot development. I am Vanessa Francis. So we started looking at narrative writing yesterday and we looked at plot development. Today we are going to continue that and focus on crafting the plot. So we looked at conflict yesterday and now we're going to look at how you craft the plot. So of course, here are our objectives for today. So you should be able to describe the various elements of plot. You should be able to discuss the various methods of crafting the plot. And of course, you should be able to employ various methods of crafting the plot in your own writing when you get to do it. So of course, we'll start with elements of plot. Now, you're looking at a plot structure pyramid. This is the simplest one you will ever find. And here are the various elements. So you see at the bottom where there is a blue line, and notice it's flat, you have the exposition. And then between the exposition and the rising action, you have the inciting incident. Then of course, your plot is supposed to climb. So you have your rising action and then it leads up to the climax. Now pay keen attention. On the other side of that pyramid, it is not falling all the way back down. It falls a little. So that's where you have the falling action, and then immediately after that, you have the resolution. Now you need to keep that type of visual in your mind, because after the climax, you should be getting ready to wind down and wrap up your story. So let's look at the exposition. Keep in mind that the exposition is not necessarily going to be in every single story. You're advised, given the very small word limit you're working with, and yes, technically it's a small word limit, 450 words is small, you do not have the wherewithal to have an extensive exposition to start your story. You really and truly want to get into the meat of the action. The term is called in medias res. So you want to start with some activity going on. You want to start with a bang, you want to start with a pop, you want to really zing. So the exposition does not have to be the very first thing you do in your story. It can come after you open the story with something to grab your reader's attention initially. Now, the function of the exposition is to really give some information to the reader, set up the story. So you're going to make sure that your readers know what is the regular, what is the day-to-day, what is the normal for your characters. Usually the exposition is used to introduce characters, perhaps to describe the setting briefly, just to give us an idea of what is going to take place. Now the inciting incident, very important. Remember, when we looked at conflict, you would have to have something that gets that conflict going. So this is where you introduce that idea, that this is where the conflict starts. So this incident now will put the main character in a challenging situation. So whatever the conflict is that you have designed, this is where you throw them right in the midst of it. And of course, you want to make sure that you build on that as you go through the story. So don't just introduce us to the conflict and then it just evaporates. You introduce us to the conflict and then you start building your momentum. So of course, the rising action is important at this point. So it's the biggest point of the story because you notice from the diagram, it had the longest line. So the rising action is where you intensify what is happening in the story. So you have introduced us to the characters, you have introduced us to the conflict. Now this is the point where you start gassing up and getting ready. Now you want to make sure that as you go through the rising action, you are building the stakes. You're making things even more and more important as you go along. You want to ensure that you are heightening the suspense. You're heightening the drama. You're heightening all the tension. And then throughout the rising action is where you let us understand what is important, what are the stakes, what is up for grabs, what is the situation going to yield. So we need to know this as we go through your rising action. Now, what the dilemma or the conflict? We looked at this previously, but let's glance over it fast. So this is very important. No conflict, no story, because the conflict is an essential part of your plot. If you do not have a conflict, you really don't have a plot. So you want to make sure that you are clear in expressing what the conflict is. The reader should know what the central conflict is. Remember, you can have several minor conflicts throughout, but we really ought to know what the main one is. Now for the moment of truth, the climax. Now remember from the diagram, it was at the very top. Now the thing about this is the climax. Most teachers and most books will tell you it's the highest point of tension. Remember, you were building and building and building tension all along. So you were building to this moment. Think of a pressure cooker. It starts to do what my mother would call the shuku. So it starts making that sound. But if you keep it on for long enough, what is going to happen? It's going to explode. Now, what you want is to build the tension to a point where it reaches its peak, and that is where your character is going to face the problem head on. That is where the character who has been more or less either dodging the problem or trying to find a way to solve the problem will now face it. So, of course, you're going to use your narrative techniques to help you bring all of this together. Now, what are narrative techniques? Basically, the methods and the devices you use to tell the story, the strategies you use to relay the information, and of course, in doing this, you provide deeper meaning for the reader and also for yourself, because you are also going along with us on this journey. So let's look at some elements now. So you have the narrative point of view, which is very important. We need to know who is telling the story. From what point of view have you chosen to relate the story? You have the use of dialogue. We touched on that in characterization. We touched on that in conflict. You need dialogue, and you need dialogue that is functional. Your dialogue must serve a purpose. It shouldn't just be in there for the sake of saying you included dialogue. You also can use time or time shifts. Now, we're going to look at that in some more details, but this is also very good in crafting your plot. And of course, you should always strive to incorporate figurative language. So let's look at the point of view first. Now, the point of view is the perspective from which you have chosen to tell the story. That means somebody is directing the reader through the story. Now, you have various points of view that we will look at, but before you start the story, note the question and how it is phrased, because sometimes the prompt, is phrased in such a way that your narrative point of view is chosen for you. So if your prompt says, I did this or I did that, right then and there, your point of view has to be from I. First person. But if it is open, then that gives you a little leeway in how to go about telling the story, from what point of view you want to tell the story. So pay close attention to the story prompt, and it will tell you what perspective you're to use. So here are the three main ones: first person, third person limited, and third person omniscient. First person narration. Of course, for this one, as I mentioned earlier, I is from the I perspective. So your narrator is in the story, telling the story. So you will see a lot of I being used, a lot of me and we. So first person pronouns will be used for this perspective. And then, of course, it's going to focus mainly on the narrator. Since the narrator is in the story, telling the story from their own perspective, then we are only really going to learn about the narrator's thoughts and feelings. We're only really going to learn about what the narrator is seeing and how they're reacting to what they're seeing and going through. But the good thing about this one, because you're telling it from the I or the me perspective, then it allows your reader to become a part of this story. So your reader who is reading about I am doing this and this is happening to me becomes the I. The reader becomes the me. The reader becomes invested in your story. Now, of course, there would be disadvantages to this. Disadvantages will work on the idea that you might be very biased because you are going to be telling the story from your personal perspective. So therefore, how am I going to know really and truly that you're giving us the entire story? What if you claim that this other character is the antagonist, but you leave out the part where you probably set things in motion for this character to become the antagonist? You won't tell us that because you don't want us to take the side of the antagonist. You want us to stay on your side. So this perspective lends itself to bias, but that is fine. You choose how you want to write your story. Now, the next disadvantage is that the reader is limited to what the narrator knows and what the narrator expresses. So the reader cannot know what is going on outside of the narrator's understanding. So the narrator is basically in charge. This narrator is going to push us in whichever direction that person wants to go. So we have no freedom to decide that we want to focus on this person or that person because the only person's thoughts we're hearing are that of the narrator. And of course, because of that, authorial intrusion comes in. That means you as the author are going to say things directly or indirectly to guide us along, to lead us along, and to distract us from something we might have been interested in earlier, but you bring up another situation for us to just go off course. So in this case, you as the author really and truly have all the power and all the knowledge. Now for third person limited. Now remember, first person is from the I perspective. Third person now is from a neutral, seemingly neutral perspective. So this person is an onlooker. So your narrator is not in the story this time. Your narrator is just looking on and telling us what happened. Also, it focuses mainly on the main character because this person, as it said, is limited. So this narrator's knowledge is also limited. Now, I did say it presents a supposedly neutral perspective because you're thinking, if I am not in the story, I am not part of the story, then I should be telling it from a very unbiased platform. However, because this narrator is limited, then that can lead to some amount of bias because that narrator now can be taking the side again of the main character while leaving out the different reasons why another character might be the good guy and not this one. Disadvantages, of course, are there. So the reader this time is distanced. So unlike in the first person narration when you're in it and part of the action taking place, this time it's like you're up high and you're looking down at everything going on. So you're not emotionally invested as you were with the first person narration. Now, of course, again, just as with the first person narration, your knowledge is limited to what the narrator shares, and the narrator is not sharing knowledge about all the different characters. The narrator here is still focusing on the main character. So both first and third person limited focus on the main character. And again, because of that, there is potential for bias. So we don't know if because you want us to like your character, you build up your character in such a way that we fall in love with them, we cheer for them, we feel bad when they don't do well. whereas there might be another character who is more deserving of that love and compassion and empathy. So now, your third person, omniscient. Now, omniscient means all-knowing, all-seeing. So this one gives us a wider range to look at. So you are looking at the perspectives of various characters, not just one. So you can have 2 or 3 characters, and we are hearing from each of those. We're hearing their thoughts, we're seeing their actions. We're not restricted to just the main character. We can get both sides of the story. We can learn about the main character, who is your protagonist, and we can learn about your antagonist, because we'll hear from your antagonist too. So it gives a more balanced approach. Now, of course, we still have disadvantages to look at. So the first one, again, the reader is still distanced because the reader is still looking on and not part of the story. And there still is potential for bias, because even though you're giving us this multiple perspective, you still, crafty little you, can still focus on the main attributes of the protagonist and focus on the main disadvantages of the antagonist. So you still can manipulate the story however you choose, even though you're giving us multiple perspectives. So now we look at the use of dialogue. We have talked about dialogue in various respects. So now let's look at how you use dialogue in crafting the plot. So here is a list of functions. So dialogue adds a sense of realism. So when we hear the characters talking, we hear them interacting, we hear them even thinking aloud, it gives us a sense of reality, like this is actually something that is happening. Rather than you just narrating the whole thing, we want to hear from the characters as well. We want to hear their thoughts being spoken out. We want to hear their ideas being spoken out. We want to hear what they plan to do. And of course, it helps with characterization. You think of what the characters say, you think of who they talk to, you think of how they talk. So how they talk when they're in one situation as opposed to how they talk when they're in a different situation. All of that comes in with the characterization. Think also of how it develops the conflict or how it introduces the conflict. So it gives you more freedom as the narrator. So you, the narrator, don't have to, in the narration, say what the problem is. Your characters can talk about the problem. And that way, we will learn what the problem is too. And the additional benefit of that, we can know how great this problem is to the various characters because they are expressing it to us. And of course, it can advance the plot. Your characters can talk about or think aloud of the things that they plan to do or should do or think they might do. So it can give us an idea of what is coming up next in the plot. And later on, we'll see how that can be used again in a different method. And of course, it can enhance the mood or the tone. So the characters talking to each other or themselves can create the mood, create the tone. If the characters are angry, the way they're talking will reveal that, yes, the mood right now is a very tense one. If the characters are sad, then the way they're talking and what they're saying will tell us that, yes, they're not feeling up to par, they're not feeling like themselves, they're probably wondering what is going to happen, things like that. The use of time is very important, and we're going to go in more details about the use of time shortly. But think about the idea that, remember, you have 450 words in estimate to write your story. You don't have the benefits of a full-length novel. You don't have the benefits of even the short stories that you would see in literature. So yours is really short. Even though for some of you, I know you're crying that the 450 can't make, it can. So you're going to use the time wisely. You have to use the time in order to fill in some details that we might be missing in the current chronology of the story. So when we get into that, you'll see how you can use time to your advantage. So these are the ways that you will use time. You're going to use time in flashback, or you can use time in foreshadowing, or you can use time in flash forward. So when we come back, this is what we will look at. So we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with more English. You can tell us, was it 5 years ago John Brown and Jim White had a fight, and somehow John Brown never forgave Jim White for that fight, and now it has manifested itself in a different way in the present day? Now for foreshadowing. So we looked at looking back in time. Foreshadowing now does the opposite. Foreshadowing gives us an indication of what is to come. So it gives us a little hint. So it does not say these two characters are going to fight, but there is something that happens that leads us to wonder, is something like a fight on the horizon? And usually you don't really realize that something was foreshadowed until after it actually happens. So you want to use it to create suspense. Remember, you're working from marks. And if you're writing a story, the whole idea is you want to capture the reader from the first words on your page to the last full stop on your page. Or if it's a different end mark, no problem there. So you want to make sure that you maintain a level of suspense right through the writing that engages the reader, that captures the reader's imagination, that keeps the reader reading. That is what you're working towards, keeping the reader glued to your story. It can also tease us. So you might want to drop a little, what they call Easter eggs in the movies. You might want to drop a little Easter egg and we start to wonder, why did this happen? And then later on we find out why. No problem there. Now, what does it function as? Of course, creates or enhances the tension. And it is great to use to prepare us for what you have in store. So if there is going to be a big revelation, then you can use the foreshadowing to give us a hint that some big revelation is coming, some mind-blowing wow moment is approaching. And you want to set up the foreshadowing, but not too obviously. You want to ensure that we see it coming, but you don't want to overuse foreshadowing. You can't spend the whole story foreshadowing, because then you'll be foreshadowing your life away. When do we get the actual experience of your story? So you want to make sure you don't overuse it, but you don't underuse it either. So you have to strike a balance. Now, it comes in various types. So you have direct or overt foreshadowing. Now, in this case, what you do, you're going to openly suggest that a problem is coming up, or an event is coming up, or a twist is coming up. Now, you achieve this through your characters' dialogue. So the characters can talk about the coming events. Remember, we spoke earlier about how you can use dialogue. So here's where it can drop in again. So the characters are going to talk about an upcoming event. And notice the example given in Macbeth, when Shakespeare uses direct foreshadowing, when the witches predict that Macbeth will become the Thane of Cawdor and later a king. So the witches actually say that this will happen. So they foreshadow all of that is coming up next. So in this case, it is direct. We didn't have to guess what it meant. We saw that this is what it means. Now you think about the indirect or the covert, and this one requires a little more creativity. So in the direct, you just say it out loud. But in the indirect, this is where your true creativity will shine. So you're going to leave the hints, and they're going to be subtle. But remember, you don't want them to be so subtle that we miss them entirely. So the reader might not, at that point in time, realize that you were foreshadowing. But later in the plot, they will see that you were hinting that something was going to happen. So perhaps you would have something break. A valuable heirloom falls and breaks and is shattered. That can foreshadow something happening down the line to the family. So another example you can look at in The Empire Strikes Back. Luke Skywalker sees a face behind Darth Vader's mask, and the face is his. Now, up until that point, Luke had no understanding, no realization, no knowledge that Darth Vader was really his father. So him having that vision and seeing the face that is really his was foreshadowing that relationship, that these two are like this. So there are different techniques you can use. So of course, we spoke about dialogue. So the dialogue, they talk about the things that are to come. They might give a joke. They might make an offhand comment. They might just say something or not say something. And that will help us to understand that something is coming down the line. Now here we have Romeo and Juliet. When Romeo says, "My life were better ended by their hate than death prorogued, wanting of thy love." And we know, based on what we know about the play, that eventually he does die. So this little statement here actually foreshadows that he was going to die eventually because of love. The title can work with foreshadowing as well. So remember, when you write your story, you need to give it a title. Sometimes you're given a title to work with. In that case, you can twist it to your understanding. So you use the title you're given and you use it in your story. So you use the title to make what you want of it. In a case where you're not given a title, create a title that is somehow significant to the story. Try not to just have a generic title. Give your story a title that is of significance, and you can use the title to foreshadow something. So here's an example. In this piece of writing by Edgar Allan Poe, his title was The Fall of the House of Usher. And it foreshadows the destruction of the physical premises, but also the house of Usher, meaning the family. So that title foreshadowed the family's downfall, the family's deterioration, their destruction. You can use your setting as well. And when you use setting, you can use some amount of pathetic fallacy in your setting to foreshadow things. So you can choose a setting that will foreshadow death. Of course, the most obvious one is to have somebody visit a cemetery. But there are other settings that could foreshadow death. There are other settings that could foreshadow victory. There are other settings that could foreshadow sadness. So use the setting wisely. So here you see that in Great Expectations, Dickens uses the weather to foreshadow the dark turn in Pip's story. So this is an example of pathetic fallacy now, where nature and the elements in nature are more or less mimicking what is going on in the piece of literature. Figurative language. You have to include figurative language in your writing if you want the top marks, because you are being tested on how you use language creatively and effectively. So you need to ensure that you use figurative language to bring out various ideas and concepts. So of course, the most obvious ones, your similes and your metaphors. You can use these to foreshadow, but those are not the only ones. Remember that there are a myriad of different figurative language items you can employ in order to get your point across, in order to foreshadow. So if you look at this example, now, the betrayal of David by his mother is expressed in this way. I sat looking at Peggotty for some time, in a reverie on this supposititious case, whether if she were employed to lose me like the boy in the fairy tale, I should be able to track my way home again by the buttons she would shed. Now, you have several things happening there. You have literary allusion to. If you think carefully, what story can you remember where a child is lost? Well, it's more than one child, but think of a child being lost and they make their way back following a trail that they had left. Hansel and Gretel. So right here, you have a simile being used to compare his situation to that one, and you also have the literary allusion to this fairy tale. So you are free to use several figurative language devices in your story. And the more effectively you use them, the better it will work out for you, the higher the marks you will earn. So your character traits can foreshadow things as well. Now, your character's appearance can do it, or what they're wearing, how they behave, their mannerisms. Now, what you can use that to do is again to give us some hints. We looked at characterization earlier, and these are the things that you can use to show something is going to happen later on. So if your character is constantly angry, then that is telling us something that is to come. If your character is constantly sad, that is telling us something to come. If your character wears red quite often, maybe that is indicating to us danger. If your character is always dressed in black, that could also indicate danger. That could also indicate maybe sadness. So you can use your character's traits in the description, in their characterization, to foreshadow something to come. So if you have set up your story in such a way that the antagonist is not obvious to us, but you attribute something to the antagonist. Maybe they always wear the color blue. So this person always has something on that is blue. Later on, we'll realize you were warning us. The blue, maybe they were going to set a dam free. Maybe they were going to shoot rockets from the sky. So we associate those things with the color blue, the sky and water. So perhaps you were hinting to us that this was the person who was going to be causing the problem. So you can use that to your advantage. So we have this example here, and I'm going to be honest, I never initially knew this. So this is why it's important for you to read, because in watching the movie, this did not come out, but in reading the book, it would have come out. So the example is, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, it says that Professor Quirrell's turban is described. The writer makes sure to describe it, and she also makes sure to talk about Harry's curiosity about it. And then it is later that we discover that that turban is being used to hide something. Now, when you watch the movie, I'm sure this did not come out. You did not see Harry being curious about the turban or anything like that. So this is why I said earlier, it is good to watch the movies and the series and the programs to see the different things coming out. But it is more important to read, to know how to write about them. So, of course, now that you understand what foreshadowing is, let's look at how you can successfully use it. So, of course, you have to have an idea of where your story is headed. So you can't use the foreshadowing and you don't have any idea what you plan to do in your story. What you're foreshadowing, you need to know. So you have to have a plan, and then in that plan you know what is to come down the line, so you can drop the little hints prior to that. And of course, you have to revise it. Look back and see, does it make sense? And then, if you need to, plan some more. Now notice, plant the seeds as early as possible. Those of you who have farms, those of you who have your little cottage gardens and so on, understand the importance of planting your seeds early. Now, you want to make sure that the foreshadowing event is not too close to what it foreshadows. It needs to be a little distance away, not too far away now. So you can't foreshadow at the very beginning of the story and then what you're foreshadowing doesn't occur till the very end. But you do not want to have the foreshadowing in this paragraph and then the event in the following paragraph. So again, this is why planning is important. So you want to make sure you have the seeds early enough that you give us a little tease. Remember, it's a tease or a hint. And then eventually, as we read along, it comes to light. So if you put it too close to what is going to happen, then you kind of end up spoiling the whole thing. There's no big surprise anymore because you've already kind of given us the idea that, oh, something is coming right after this. And then another farming analogy, scatter the seeds. So all your foreshadowing hints will not be in one place. They are supposed to be spread out so that we just keep getting a little hint here, a little hint there, a little hint somewhere else. Don't bulk everything in one place. Same way when you're describing your characters, don't put everything in one position. Again, if you've ever been on a scavenger hunt, you know that you spread out the different hints, and one hint will lead to another. So you want to spread them out, and you want to ensure that they are effectively used. And you want to, of course, make sure that these things, because you have spread them out, keep us interested. So in case we were sort of forgetting, you drop another one to remind us. And of course, you need to foreshadow in moderation. I said it already. You can't have the whole story focusing on just foreshadowing. So you have to use it wisely. You have to use it in moderation. So you don't want to wear out the reader guessing, 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 guessing. There must be a little guessing here. You give us some information, a little hint again, give us some more information. And then if you don't foreshadow enough, the opposite will happen. We're going to see something and wonder, how did this come about? There was nothing to tell us that this was going to happen. So again, balance is key. So you want to make sure that you put the little hints there. You don't put them all in one place, but you spread them out enough that we get into it. Of course, you need to make sure that when you're doing your practice writing, not in the exam, it cannot happen in the exam, but you're going to be practicing for the exam. So while you're doing your practice writing, ensure that you get somebody to read your writing, somebody who can be critical, somebody who can let you know if what you're writing makes sense, if what you're doing actually ties into the general idea of what you plan to have. All right? So get a second set of eyes, somebody who reads a lot, somebody who can be honestly critical of your work. So at this point, we're going to go to our final break. When we come back, we'll conclude today's lesson. Welcome back to class time. So we're continuing our look at crafting your plot. So now we're going to look at the use of figurative language. And again, remember, this is where the big money marks belong. So of course, this is the use of words in a way that deviates from the conventional order. So you're not going to use words the way regular people use words. You're going to use words in a creative sense, and you're going to make sure that it adds color and clarity to your writing. Now, one major way you can get through this is through the use of imagery. Now, imagery is very important in your writing. You want to create pictures because it's not a movie. You're not watching it unfold. However, your words should do that. Your words should let us visualize. We should hear, see, smell, feel what is going on in your writing. So, of course, what is it? Imagery, of course, is figurative language, and it is used to represent objects or actions or ideas. And it does this in a way to appeal to your physical senses. So each of your senses has a specific type of imagery associated with it. So here are the types. The visual, of course, is what you can see. Makes sense. So when you're talking about the visual images, you're looking at visual descriptions. You're looking at what attributes are highlighted, such as color, size, shape, light and dark, shadows, shade, that sort of thing. The next type is the oral. So this one has to do with what you can hear. So the sound images come out here. And for this, of course, you're looking at pitch, frequency, intensity, the pace of a sound, the loudness of the sound, anything associated with sound. So if you want to build tension, then you can describe some sound. Some screaming might be happening. There might be somebody shouting for help. So you have to emphasize this to build up. And of course, you can use your devices such as your onomatopoeia and your alliteration. These are called sound devices. So these can help us to visualize what we're hearing. Then you have your olfactory imagery now. This has to do with things that you smell. Now, smell is powerful, you know. The sense of smell is powerful. Many studies have shown that the sense of smell is linked to memory. So if you can describe a particular sense through smell, then you also take your reader back to that place. So you want to associate the smell with a certain memory. You can do this, and your reader will go along with this journey too. So of course, you're going to talk about odors and fragrances. Connotation again, odors usually something unpleasant, whereas fragrances usually something pleasant. So if you want to talk about something that is pleasant, you would talk about maybe the fragrance of the flowers. You talk about the fragrance of somebody's cologne. Or you can also have unpleasant colognes as well. So you can say it was so strong that you were stifling, you were choking. The next type of image, tactile. This has to do with things you can feel. So you sense it through your skin. And of course, if you're going to talk about things you can feel, you're looking at things like temperature. You're looking at things like hardness and softness. You're talking about things like resistance. So things you can feel. So you're going to ensure that when you are writing, you bring these out because we are multisensory beings. So try not to only talk about things that you see. It's very easy to talk about things that you see. Try and incorporate other senses as well. Gustatory images, things that you can taste. And of course, these are usually very good to include. So if your characters are having a meal, you can describe the meal. Now, what happens is this one tends to be very underutilized. So practice in your writing to include some gustatory images, because you can as well enhance what you're doing through these senses. Then you can look at things that require movement. So kinesthetic images. So you're talking about someone running, maybe a heart pounding, things that you can see moving or things that you can experience moving. A speeding train perhaps, lift off in a plane or landing a plane. Those are the things that you can experience kinesthetically. So you talk about those, and that will help and enhance your writing as well. So you can think about how you can incorporate this sense, and it links very closely to the tactile sense as well. So they go hand in hand. So you won't have a big issue or a big problem putting them together. And here are some examples of things you can refer to. So rushing water, flapping wings. We mentioned pounding hearts. These are things that move, and these are things that you can experience. And many people can relate to as well, because everything you want to put in is something that is creative, yes, but it's also relatable. So here is your homework. You are going to outline the plot structure. And in this, you're going to include the various plot features that you would include based on this prompt. This prompt should look familiar. To this day, people passing through Coconut Grove still stop and ask for Waspy. Now, here's what you're going to do. You have to analyze this situation. Remember, we have been talking about crafting the plot. So you have to make sure, visualize this now. Who is Waspy going to be in your story? Is he going to be your protagonist? Is he going to be your antagonist? The next thing you have to ensure you do, what type of situation are you going to set up in your story? How are you going to build the story up to the climax? So what are the different events that will contribute to the rising action? What is going to be the climax? What is going to be that big power moment? What is going to be the situation that your protagonist has to face, and face miraculously or face triumphantly? Or perhaps they're going to go in doubtfully and come out victorious. Then the next thing you have to do, remember now, once you hit the climax, your story should not continue for 5 more pages. It should not drag on and drag on indefinitely. Once you hit the climax, now you start to wrap it up. So once you hit your climax, once your protagonist has faced the issue, has conquered the issue, then you start veering off. So now your protagonist needs to perhaps move on to a different challenge. You can give us a little teaser that there's another challenge to come, no problem with that. You can have a little twist at the end, no problem with that. But remember, no, your major conflict has to be resolved. You have to make sure that your protagonist solves that issue that they were plagued with throughout the story. Next thing you need to do, have your little resolution. It needs to end on a final note. We should know that the story has ended. So I know some of you like the idea of a cliffhanger, but you don't want it to be hanging indefinitely. All right? So that's all for today. We've been discussing narrative writing, plot development, looking at crafting the plot. So please keep safe, wash your hands regularly, sanitize, and wear your masks.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.